Well, the short answer is lots. Last year, on the 1st of January 2021, 3 years after it's first opened for signatures, what is called the African Continental Free Trade Area was formally implemented. Now, the Free Trade Area, the AfCFTA, is a project of the African Union's Agenda 2063. Now, this Agenda 2063, in the African Union's own words, is a plan to, quote, transform Africa into a global powerhouse of the future by the year 2063. Now, this plan has a few other objectives. It includes creating an African Union passport to ensure visa-free travel across the continent. It will also entail plans for a single transport air market, and of course the free trade area, which is one of the most economically exciting developments from the continent in recent years. Now, so far, the free trade area has been signed by 54 of the 55 African Union states, and a further 41 states have ratified it through their governments, which means it's kind of formally implemented in the law. And today, that means it is the largest free trade area in the world in terms of participating countries. And in the minds of many people who study the issue, the free trade area in Africa can really be seen as one of the best opportunities in Africa's history for the trading relationships of all states to be based on free trade and continued economic liberalization. Now, one of the very exciting things this highlights for classical liberals is just how far prevailing ideologies have shifted across the continent in recent years. After independence, so-called African socialism was enormously popular, and it was often championed as the only route to the continent's prosperity. And to highlight kind of how much just ideologies have shifted, it's worth considering about the organization of African unity. Now, what that organization was, it was the predecessor to the current African Union. And that was founded back in the 60s. And according to, say, Kwame Nkrumah, who was who was the first leader of an independent Ghana and one of the founding members of this organization, he believed that this organization should exist because a united socialist Africa was the necessary condition for the realization of the African personality. And those were his words, not mine. And the organization was really guided by African socialism. But then you fast forward 60 or so years, and the African Union, the successor organization, has just implemented the world's largest free trade area. And when it was opened for signatures in 2018, the president of Rwanda, Paul Kagame, who was the chairperson of the AU, so he was the one putting it forward for signatures, described himself as an avid free trader. And many other African leaders have said similar things about the benefits of free trade. So while there's really little doubt that some protectionism will remain rife in quite substantial parts of the continent, the fact that there's a free trade area, it's been signed by 54 of the 55 countries, it really does show to us that economically liberal ideas are really gaining traction in the world's most protectionist continent. Well, much of Africa's post-colonial history has really been marred by governmental mismanagement of the economy. For several decades after independence, policies such as central planning, expropriation without compensation, price and wage controls, and state-owned enterprises were all commonplace. Now, following the fall of the Soviet Union, which had previously bankrolled many African socialist dictators, many African states were kind of reintroduced into the global economy, regional economic communities began to grow. And if we look at measures that study economic freedom or the ease of doing business, Africa as a whole has become substantially more liberal since the 1990s when we look at the economy. But there is still a really long way to go. If we look at average applied tariff rates on imports into African states, they're very high when compared to other regions. And it's also very difficult not only to trade into Africa, but between African states. And today it is several times more expensive to transport goods just 1,700 kilometers from Douala in Cameroon to N'Djamena in Chad. So that's only 1,700 kilometers away. And yet it's several times more expensive to transport them those distance rather than transporting them more than 12,000 kilometers away, more than 7 times further to Shanghai, China. So it's cheaper to transport goods all the way across the world than it is just a short distance between neighboring states. And of course, in part, this is because of poor infrastructure, but tariffs and non-tariff barriers also play a large role. So by reducing them, African states are able to trade far more with each other. Another recent idea that's been quite common in the last few years is that by removing barriers to trade between African states, the free trade area can really be seen to a limited extent as removing some of the arbitrariness that exists between African borders, which remain a harmful colonial legacy. And it also could help kind of restore some of the traditional trade routes that once zigzagged across the continent in pre-colonial times. And finally, I'd say more free trade is great news because at the end of the day, barriers to trade reduce the amount of trade that can take place. That's fairly self-explanatory. And if you reduce the amount of trade that can take place, you then also reduce the amount of wealth and value the economy can create. Ultimately, free exchange creates wealth as it leaves both parties better off. And therefore, more free trade will help ensure that more wealth can be created across the African continent. So over the next 4 to 9 years, if your state is categorized as a non-less developed country, or 9 years if your state is categorized as a less developed country. So between 4 to 9 years, the free trade area aims to remove 90% of tariffs on goods traded between African states. And within 12 years, it aims to remove more than 97% of tariffs on goods traded between states, which is incredible news. And this could have a huge impact on Africa's economy. The World Bank, which is an organization that I'd say typically isn't too optimistic about the impact of trade deals, has estimated that if all 55 African states were to ratify the free trade area, that by 2035, more than 30 million people could be lifted from extreme poverty, which means people living on less than $1.90 per person per day. So 30 million people out of extreme poverty. It could lift more than 68 million people out of moderate poverty, which means on less than $5.50 per person per day, boost regional income by almost $500 billion, and increase wages of both men, women, skilled and unskilled workers between 9 to 10%, which is outstanding just for a free trade area. And then the World Bank adds to that they expect the poorest nations to experience the greatest economic gains from the free trade area's implementation. Well, manufacturing is certainly one of the main ones. So the UN estimates that the free trade area could increase intra-African trade by about 52% within a few years' time, and even as much as 100% if a reasonable amount of non-tariff barriers were removed too. And this is important because when African states trade with each other, the goods they trade are more than 3 times more likely to be higher valued manufactured goods when compared to goods that leave the continent. So today, for more than 3/4 of African nations, commodities make up more than 70% of their total exports. And while there's nothing necessarily wrong with reliance on commodities, if there are weak institutions, this could lead to a so-called resource curse. And it's also worth considering that raw materials are far more likely to experience price fluctuations. And then if you're extremely reliant on these raw materials that are going up and down in price all the time, this can create economic volatility, unstable business environments, and no investors would want to invest in an economy that's unstable. So therefore, if a free trade area can increase intra-African trade, in turn, it will increase manufacturing trade. And then this will help diversify exports, help create a more stable business environment, which then will create more investment too. And if this is done on a large enough scale, in a way, it could really launch Africa's industrial revolution. But away from manufacturing, I'd say agriculture is another big area that will be impacted by this free trade area. And this is important because the majority of jobs in Africa are in the agricultural sector. So despite being home to more than 60% of the world's arable land, the continent somehow still remains a net importer of food. And today, the average tariff on agricultural goods in Africa is almost 20%. So if we can remove some of these tariffs or even reduce them by a large margin, it will mean foodstuffs can flow more easily across borders, there'll be more trade in agricultural produce, and this will not only mean larger markets for producers wanting to sell their goods, but also cheaper prices for consumers, which means fuller stomachs for everyone, really. And it has been estimated that by 2040, the free trade area could increase inter-African trade in just agricultural products by more than 30%. So I'd say manufacturing and agriculture are two of the main ones. Well, there are several. So one of the biggest ones is there's a concern that some states have ratified the free trade area, despite not really being supportive of free trade, and they've ratified just for power or influence at the negotiation table. One of the best examples of that, I'd say, is Nigeria. They said for a long time, for years, that they weren't going to ratify the free trade area. And yet, just 1 month before its implementation, they decided to quickly ratify it, get it over the line. But yet, they've, in regards to their trade policy, have not been implementing policies that can be seen as free trade. For over a couple of years, in recent times, they had their borders closed to their neighbors. Then they've only partially reopened them to some trade and some different types of vehicles, but not all of them. So there's concern some states have just kind of joined just to get their feet around the negotiation table and don't really care about free trade all that much. Another concern is that the amount of tariff liberalization could be watered down. As I mentioned at the beginning, for some states, it's going to be more than 9 years until their 90% of tariffs will be reduced. And a lot can change in 9 years. So there's a concern, not only could some states pull out, but also that it could potentially be watered down, especially if there's regional powerhouses such as Nigeria at the negotiation table and not being too supportive of free trade. But there's a few other issues as well. Rules of origin is quite difficult to control. So, for example, the 90% of tariffs being removed would only apply for goods that are made in Africa or have a certain percentage of their manufacturing process that has occurred in Africa. And to be honest, few countries on the continent have custom mechanisms that are effective enough to enforce these rules of origins. It's very difficult to know, if you were looking at like a shoe, for example, what percentage of a shoe was made in Rwanda versus China versus Kenya or whatever else. So it's very hard for some states and their custom mechanisms to enforce that. But ultimately, I do think the free trade area could be beneficial, but it really comes down to governments and policymakers and journalists and think tankers, both in Africa and across the world, coming together to show their support for this agreement and really try to bind African governments to the free trade area, which they ratified, so that it can't be watered down or changed in too many negative ways. So I mentioned earlier that the free trade area is expected to increase the wealth in the continent by quite a substantial margin. Many more people out of extreme poverty, many more people entering the middle class. So this is, of course, great news for the UK, because if there's richer people across the world, it means there's more markets for us to trade with. There's more people potentially wanting to buy our exports, and more markets to import from. So that's great news. Less people in extreme poverty and indeed more moderate poverty could have an impact on reducing the amount of aid that we send to various countries in the continent. And then one of the more substantive ways it could have an impact on the UK economy is that the free trade area does have a plan, although not a very detailed or laid out one, of eventually becoming a customs union. So it could be likely that the free trade area one day does become a customs union. And that could theoretically help the UK, because rather than having to send trade delegates to either each individual regional economic community or each individual state to create a trade deal, they could just negotiate a trade deal with one central body. And that would not only save time and money, but it would also just be far easier to negotiate. And it could mean that there could be a UK-Africa free trade area if the free trade area eventually turns into a customs union.
Well, if you enjoyed that conversation, why not watch one of these other videos? And while you're here, remember to hit the subscribe button and the notification bell. That way, you'll never miss out on a single IEA broadcast.